Welcome, everyone. Good to see you again. My name is Ryan Bell. I'm the National Organizing Manager here at the Secular Student Alliance. And this is day 2 of the Secular Student Alliance virtual conference. We're really happy that you're all here with us. And those of you joining us on social media, thanks for joining. This is going to be a great session, super informative. I saw an earlier version of Alison's presentation, and I'm really excited to sort of refresh my memory. There's a lot here and requires a little going back over it, I think. At least it did for me. Alison Gill is the Vice President for Legal and Policy Issues at American Atheists. She covers the litigation and advocacy areas of the work that American Atheists does, and is responsible for all those amazing reports and the legislative tracker that you may have seen, and all those beautiful graphics. Well, I don't know if you make the graphics, but your graphics are beautiful. Prior to being with American Atheist, Alison worked as a consultant with a number of nonprofits focusing on advocacy strategy and systemic change, as a senior legislative counsel at the Human Rights Campaign and other organizations in the LGBTQ advocacy world. And we're really grateful to have her now in the secular community. And Alison's going to give her presentation. And at the conclusion of that presentation, we will take questions from the audience. So be thinking of questions that you have. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little button that says Q&A. You can click there and submit your question. If you are on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, you can also submit your question in the comments there. And use the hashtag SSACon, and it'll be easier for us to find your question that way and relay it back to Alison. So without any further delay, Alison, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to speak with you all. So who's excited to speak about data? I know it's the most interesting topic. So we're going to, let me just share my slides here so you can see everything. Let's see. Okay, how's that looking, Ryan?
Looks great. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, great. So I'm just going to go through everything, but I really do encourage you to add your questions to the chat. I hope we have a lot of questions. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're doing this, is because it's a little bit in depth and it's maybe more scientific than most presentations, but I want to make sure that you have a good understanding what we're talking about. So please do ask questions. I'm going to try to get through everything and then get to questions at the end. So I'm going to definitely save some time for it. So let's talk about reality check and the research that we did on non-religious people. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why we need data on non-religious people and why we did this research. Second, we'll talk about the US Secular Survey and the reality check report. And then I'll talk about what's coming next. And at the end, we'll do Q&A for whatever time we have remaining. So first of all, let's talk about data about non-religious people. Frankly, it's lacking. There's very little data that we have about non-religious people in this country, unfortunately. There are some really good organizational reports from population surveys conducted by organizations like the Pew Research Center and PRRI. Those are looking at religion more broadly and non-religious people as a subset of the entire population that they're sort of polling to get their numbers. So it's not like a deep dive into non-religious people, their challenges, their needs, and their beliefs. It's more of a broad, this is everybody and this is a slice. And their slice they look at is not quite the same slice that we're looking at today either. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So the purpose of the research we're doing is a little bit different. We really want to do a deep dive in our community and figure out what are the needs and challenges of non-religious people. So, but generally federal surveys in the US do not collect data about religious beliefs. That means they don't collect data about religious, majority religions, minority religions, or non-religious people. And that's really critical because in the US, the majority of useful data that we get at the national level is from federal surveys. There's surveys on education, for example, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. There's surveys on health, on things like addiction and drug use, on working environments, all sorts of important surveys. That's how we get all the data that we use to talk about our society and what's happening to people in our society. But actually, federal law prohibits asking, at least on the US Census, about religious beliefs. So, and most other federal surveys actually go along with that. They do not specifically ask about non-religious belief. And because of that, we just don't have any really solid data about those issues besides what's provided by independent organizations. All right, so I should also mention that getting onto national surveys is a really important goal for other groups that I worked on with, for example, LGBTQ communities. They spend a lot of time and effort trying to get onto national surveys, and they've been very successful getting questions about gender identity and sexual orientation and sex assigned at birth, for example, onto national surveys so that we have better data regarding those communities. We're in a pretty different situation, unfortunately, with regard to religious beliefs and lack thereof. And so we really have to move forward doing this research ourselves because it's lacking. So why is data collection important? Well, without this data, frankly, non-religious people are invisible. Like if you can't talk about people's needs and what the reality is in their lives to lawmakers and back it up with stats or have it be part of the general discourse, then it's really hard to show what the needs are, or even get people to take this community seriously as a community. Data is really important for understanding community needs. So say, is something we think a problem actually a problem? Can we show it? We really need data for that purpose. For advocacy, like for example, if I'm going to go speak with a lawmaker and I talk about why we need a particular policy, one of the first questions they're going to ask me is, well, how many people does this affect? And how are these people affected by it? And what percentages? And so that is really important to us to be able to back up what we're asking for and what we're saying to be credible when we talk about advocacy. Improving services. So one of the outcomes of this report is you'll see there's a lot of discrimination in education. And right now, we have a lot of anti-bullying services across the country in schools, but there's not necessarily any inclusion specifically for non-religious people or for religion more broadly in these anti-bullying services. So now that we know that that's an issue, perhaps we should be working with those bullying groups focusing on anti-bullying, for example, to improve their programs to make sure that they cover these communities that we can show face an increased rate of bullying and harassment. That's just to give you one example of how services could be modified. Also, seeking grants and funding. Compared to a lot of other, communities, I should say, the non-religious community is we don't have a lot of government funding or funding from foundations. It's very self-funded, which also means we don't have a lot of money for services to help the community and to promote more, broad well-being. And with numbers, we'll be better able to get at that information and show where the needs are in order to get government funding where it's available. So those are just some of the reasons why data is really important for the community. So let me give you an example of what advocacy might look like. Earlier this year, the Trump administration proposed a number of different rules regarding faith-based social services. So this is when the government gives money to a provider, and the provider then goes out and provides social services to people who need them. It could be after-school programs, it could be job training, it could be training for nurses, all sorts of, and basically the vast majority of government services are administered in this way. We're talking about billions of dollars every year. So there were some rules added under the Obama administration that were meant to protect religious freedom, saying that if you as a beneficiary of these services don't want to receive services from a religious provider, perhaps because they are discriminatory, or perhaps you just object to having to receive government services from a religious provider, then they have to both inform you of your rights and also refer you to an alternative provider. So the proposal from the Trump administration was to repeal those provisions, to say we don't have to tell you about your rights, we don't have to refer you to anybody, you just have to, take services from religious groups or not get them. And so with this data, we can show how that hurts non-religious people more explicitly. We can show the numbers of non-religious people. We can show that they face high levels of discrimination in these areas, and that the level of discrimination is higher in very religious areas where there might only be a few providers, and those providers are religious. So we can make a direct connection and show why this rule is damaging, which helps us fight against it. So this is just one example, but we have been using this data in all sorts of different ways since we got it. So I get a lot of questions about like the nuns versus non-religious people. Nuns is like a shorthand phrase that a few different organizations like Pew and PRI are using to refer to people that are religiously unaffiliated. So people that don't check a box that says they're affiliated with any specific major religion, for example, Catholicism or Muslim or any of those. So they call those people religiously unaffiliated or nuns. And there's been a lot of news media about these groups because they've been really growing over the past decades. So you can see here the first graph, the rise of the religiously unaffiliated. In 2018 to 2019, it was about 26%. So that's the highest it's been, and it's about a quarter of the population, which is huge. It's a big number, and it's been rapidly growing. However, that group is not just non-religious people. It's actually significantly broader, and it includes people like, for example, 34% of the nuns, according to a Pew poll from 2014, said that religion is somewhat or very important in their life. And 61% believe in some sort of God or universal spirit. So there's a significant proportion of those people that I don't think most non-religious people would say those people are religious. They're not non-religious, right? If they believe in God, I mean, they're by definition somewhat religious. So although the surveys sort of look at this broader group, we feel that it obscures the actual non-religious community. And if you look at the other graph, also from Pew, you can see that those who identify as agnostic or atheist total was closer to about 9%. So that's a smaller fraction of the 26%. So let's say, you know, we're closer to about 9 or maybe 10% of the US population, according to these methods. I mean, there's lots of different methods to assess this sort of thing, but that's where we are, not the real 26%. So we wanted to get at those numbers. And so in this report, we did not ask about religious affiliation in this way. We asked specifically people to take the survey if they identified with one or more non-religious labels, like atheist, agnostic, secular, skeptic, humanist, freethinker, any of those. And that way they're affirmatively identifying with one or more of those labels, as opposed to just not identifying with something else, so we can get at the core of non-religious people. So I want to make that clear. That's the community we're talking about, people that actively identify, and not this broad nuns community, which is different, and you'll see some of the differences. And with that, I'm going to move into the US Secular Survey and the Reality Check report. This US Secular Survey was a nationwide survey conducted mostly online from last fall, from October 15th through November 2nd. We conducted it through convenience sampling. We reached out to all sorts of different partner organizations at this national and also state and local level, asked them to put it out through all their channels. We put it out through all of our channels, and we had people that took the survey send it to friends who they knew who were non-religious. We did some advertising around it to get it out there broadly. We really tried to get this as widely distributed as possible. Our original goal was to get between 5,000 and 10,000 people to take the survey. We had the first 8 hours, we had more than 10,000. So we had this amazing rush of interest in the survey, which was fantastic. We ended up with nearly 34,000 non-religious people across the country taking the survey. So my first question, if you wouldn't mind putting up the poll, Ryan, is, you know, did you participate? We're just curious.
The votes are coming in. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds.
Okay. I know this is not everybody watching. It's just people watching on Zoom, right?
Yeah, just everybody watching on Zoom. Unfortunately, the poll only works in Zoom.
Of course, yeah.
But that's 84% of us. Looks like, oh, there's another one.
Yeah, so about 70%. Okay, so a lot of people participated, which is fantastic.
Let me share the results so everybody can see.
Oh, there we go.
So yeah.
That's great.
68% of us.
I'll show you some of the numbers, especially for younger people who took the survey, but we had a good age range of people taken. All right. So thank you. we end up, as I said, with 34,000 people from across the country, which was just a tremendous number that we're able to report data from. And then in May, we released the report, which I'll show you in a second, the reality check report. I don't know why I don't have that slide next. I really should. Well, anyway, I'll talk to you about the sample. So the people that took the survey, here's a few statistics on them. You can see broken out by state, how many people in each state on the right. And then we pulled a few stats. So there we pulled age ranges here. There's a lot more stats in the report, which I'll show you where it's located in a second. But we pulled some age ranges here. You see about 10% of people that took it were under age 25. Now, unfortunately, we could not go younger than 18 because of a variety of legal and other reasons. It makes it more challenging to do, much more challenging to do this sort of survey, unfortunately, if you're going younger than 18. So, but we did have about 10% under age 25. And you can see we have a good distribution of other age ranges. And you can see the gender distribution below. We had a fairly high number of trans or gender nonconforming people, about 3.6%, and more males than females overall, maybe about 58% males. But there's a lot more demographic data if you're interested about that in the report itself, and you can find it at secularsurvey.org. The entire report is, we have the executive summary of the report right on the page, and you can also download the full PDF. It's about 60 pages. And this is the beautiful cover. And so it's, I hope it's useful. It's a really great report, and I hope you take a look at it. But that's where it's available, secularsurvey.org. I'm going to be talking about a few different stats from the report and why we asked some of the questions that we did. So first of all, we asked how people identified. I mentioned that we only surveyed people that identified with one or more non-religious labels. Well, here are the labels on the left-hand side, and we asked, you know, do you identify with these labels very much, somewhat, or not at all? And you can see the one that had the most people identify with very much or somewhat, with about 95%, was atheist, followed closely by non-religious, humanist, secular. So you can see that there's a high number of people identifying in these ways. And then we also asked people from among those that you picked, what is your primary non-religious identity? And again, it was 57% chose atheist. Now, you might be thinking, well, you're American atheist. Of course, atheist was highest, which is a good point. That's what you want to think about when you're doing communion sampling. However, you know, we did ask what people were members of national organizations, and only about 10% of people that took the survey were American Atheist members or reported being American Atheist members. So we actually managed to reach far beyond our membership, fortunately, by working with a lot of other partners. So, and I should mention, this is a communion sample. So what I'm showing you is not representative of all non-religious people in America. It's only representative of people that took the survey. And so I want to be really clear about that. But at the same time, we can learn a lot about the community this way. And we can also make comparisons among people that took the survey that are then useful in other circumstances, that show some of those relationships between, like, for example, stigmatization and the outcomes of stigmatization among this population. Okay, so one of the things we asked about was concealment, which basically means, you know, concealing the fact that you are a non-religious person or you have non-religious beliefs in various different aspects of your life. And this question was based on similar questions that are used among LGBTQ populations in different contexts. So that's how we help develop this sort of question. So we asked about, you know, do you conceal your identity with people at school, strangers, people at work, extended family, etc. And by looking at these different areas, we're able to develop what's called a scale, which is an average both for the community and also for individuals, right? And then we can look at, once we have a scale, we can look at how different other circumstances we're surveying, how they affect that scale, and how, whether there's a correlation between increased increased stigmatization and increased concealment, for example. So this is the concealment question that we asked about. And you can see there's a fairly high degree of concealment among the populations that we surveyed. The average fell somewhere in the middle, was sometimes, you know, people tended to conceal their non-religious beliefs, at least sometimes in most aspects of their lives, which is a fairly high rate of concealment. And we also, I should say, know that concealment can be psychologically harmful. And there's more data about that in the report itself. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but concealment can be isolating. It can lead to increased depression. So there is some relationship between negative psychological outcomes and increased concealment. We also asked about discrimination, and that was framed in terms of negative events in various areas of a person's life within the past 3 years. So have you had any negative events in these areas of your life? And some of them are, obvious. I think almost everyone has negative events in social media. But some of them were more, I think more meaningful. Like, for example, in education, we found that about 1/3 of participants said that they had experienced discrimination or negative events in education within the past 3 years. The light blue number is for not sure, because sometimes when you face these negative events or discrimination, you don't know if it's the result of you being non-religious or not. So just to be clear, this is discrimination or negative events based on being non-religious or having non-religious beliefs. So you can see all the different areas. There was a fairly high rate of negative events in areas like education, employment, or from private businesses, which are all pretty meaningful areas of one's life. Also in the military, we found that about half of people that were service members or ex-service members and veterans had experienced some level of discrimination in the military. We also looked at stigmatization. So stigmatization can be a little bit tricky to measure. And these questions were based on, in part, on a variety of different research by Dr. Brewster, Melanie Brewster, and several other researchers in looking in this area. And we sort of picked what we chose from different areas of, different aspects of the question to put together a question on stigmatization. So we're looking at a bunch of things that frequently happen to non-religious people that are othering or stigmatizing, and look at them together and create a scale. So these are basically what are sometimes called microaggressions, or things that are, they don't rise to the level of discrimination, but they're othering and socially isolating. And then together they can result, if they happen frequently, in a way for us to measure what stigmatization looks like for the population. And so you can see the mean is somewhere in the middle here, at about, sometimes, they have these events sometimes happen to them in different circumstances. Although there's a significant number of people that frequently or almost always have each of these negative events. And these can be, really harmful or othering or isolating, really, being excluded from family events and that sort of thing. I should mention that the top item, I've been bothered by religious symbols or text in public places. We asked about that, but that was not included as part of the scale because it was not one of the tested questions, and it did not really fit with the rest of the, didn't fit into the scale sort of model. But regardless, this is how we're measuring stigmatization. And again, since we have a scale, we can compare this to different other types of measures and talk about what the outcomes look like when there's a high level of stigmatization. Okay, so we also asked about psychological impact. So we tested for likely depression. There's 2 questions that we used, and this is part of a sort of assessment that there's regularly used to test for depression. There's usually a 2-part scale and then I think a 6-part scale. And so we use the initial 2-part scale it's basically like a screening measure to see if there was likely depression. We also asked some typical questions about loneliness and isolation, and there were 3 questions relating to that. So between those 2 questions, we were able to develop scales for likely depression and also for isolation and loneliness. We also found that discrimination, negative events, and this is probably obvious, but it's with research on this, we can say more concretely, and we can show a clear correlation. Discrimination or negative events, higher stigma and greater concealment are correlated with increased loneliness and likely depression. And if you want to see more charts on that and the exact numbers, it's all available in the report. This is especially important for young people. We also asked about family rejection. So we asked people if when they were below age 25, or if they're currently below age 25, and their family is aware of their non-religious beliefs, how supportive were they of those beliefs? So if if your family was not aware when you were below age 25, then this question does not apply, because that's the sort of family rejection we're talking about, is below age 25 and people being actually aware of the rejection. And you can see here was about 40%, a little bit lower, 37%, together were very unsupportive or somewhat unsupportive of the participants' non-religious beliefs, which is a fairly high number. And we found that this has a really significant impact both on depression and on educational attainment. Let me specifically give you that number. So survey participants with very unsupportive parents were 71% more likely than those with very supportive parents to screen positive for depression. So 71% higher to screen positive for depression. So that's why I'm talking about the scale the other way. That way we can measure those impacts. But you can see that's a tremendously higher level. Also, this had an impact on individuals' likelihood to attend higher education and also to finish college. So those who are in more supportive families are much more likely to go on to higher education, and those who had very unsupportive families were much less likely to finish college. And this sort of data is actually really helpful for talking about the public health and public health impact of this research. It's one thing to show that people have high levels of stigmatization, but it's another to say, what is the impact to public health professionals? Like the things that they measure and look at are things like, how does this affect educational attainment? How does it affect measurable outcomes like depression? And so that's one of the reasons this is really helpful to show. All right, so one of the most striking things from this research that I found that I thought was really interesting was the difference in outcomes between very religious areas of the country as opposed to more non-religious areas of the country. Now, I grew up in New Jersey and I lived in DC for like the past 20 years, which are both fairly liberal cosmopolitan parts of the country. So I haven't really lived in a place that's very religious. But I know from working, we get complaints all the time from folks who do live in those countries, like legal issues, and know people that live in very religious areas who face a very different circumstance in their day-to-day life about what being an atheist or non-religious person looks like than it does in New Jersey or DC. And I think we all know that anecdotally, but now we can actually show it with this data. We can show the differences and the much higher rates of discrimination in those places that are very religious as opposed to those that are not, and the impact that has on people. So you might be asking, how did we assess how religious a place is? Well, we asked people, the participants, how religious is the community that you live in? And you can see the numbers here on the left, ranges from not at all to a little bit religious to somewhat religious to very religious. And about 1/3 of participants said they lived in very religious communities. And then in the map on the right, we charted, we mapped out those states by what percentage of participants said that their community was very religious, right? So the deep purple states are those where almost 50% or higher of people, participants, said that their community was very religious. So you can see it's kind of the states you might expect thinking about this. It's basically the mountainous west and also the south. And it's kind of intuitive, but this is helpful as a way for us to sort of measure, what is the difference in these areas. And the lighter purple is areas that were just under that. So they fall in the tier just under the deep purple ones. Areas like Texas, South Dakota, my family's from South Dakota, and a few different others like Virginia, a few other states that are overall very religious. Significant percentage of people said their communities were very religious, but not as much as in the deep purple states. And then there are states like Washington, Nevada, and basically all of New England that said that very, very few people said that they lived in very religious communities. So we plotted that how the percentage of participants saying their current community is very religious by the average stigma scale, so the stigmatization scale I spoke about earlier for that state. And you can see this really interesting, clear correlation that in more if it's a state where more people say they live in very religious areas, there's a higher level of stigmatization. And the two states that I want to point out are Mississippi and Utah, with both the highest level of highest percentage of people saying their communities are very religious, and also the highest on the stigmatization scale. So you can see that the chart here is pretty interesting. And on the right, it's actually a different map. It looks very similar, I know, but it's actually a different map. So we broke people into quartiles based on their stigmatization score overall, and sort of charted what states had the highest levels of stigmatization. And you can see it doesn't exactly align with the previous chart, but it is very close. The states with the highest overall stigmatization scale scores are in deep purple here as well. Okay, so one of the most interesting things, as I mentioned, was the great increase in discrimination in various aspects of people's lives in very religious areas versus in not religious, less religious areas. And that's what this chart really shows. So this is plotted out by a person's community, like would they say their community was not at all religious, a little bit religious, somewhat religious, or very religious, and the percentage of people in those different areas that said they faced negative events or discrimination the past 3 years on all these different areas. And I think one of the most interesting is education. So you can see in a little bit religious or not at all religious communities, it's about 17%, which is, significant, but not that high. But as soon as we go to very religious communities, it jumps up to 42%. So that's a huge level of discrimination. That's nearly 50%. That's nearly half, right, of people had some level of discrimination because of their non-religious beliefs in education. It's 2.5 times higher. So that's a really significant difference that we have to highlight and point out how this is occurring. And it's not just education. We found it across the board in every area. So public service, like what does public service include? Voting, jury duty, poll work, etc. In employment, it was nearly 3 times higher in employment between not at all religious and very religious communities, which is incredible. And also in private businesses. So that's just you're going to the bank or the movie theater or a restaurant, and religion comes up somehow, and basically that there's discrimination there. So that's about 2-fold higher. I think this is really significant, probably the most important takeaway in the report. We also looked at individual subpopulations of non-religious people and the increased disparities that they faced. So I should note that we really want to do a deeper dive into this. We just did some preliminary research. And so we're going to be doing an individual report on all of these different subpopulations so that we can, more fully assess the data and provide more of a breakout, study exactly, how it works intersectionally and where discrimination is and what the differences are for different subpopulations. And I'm going to look at youth on the next page. But you can see here that Black participants, Black non-religious people, were about half as likely to have supportive parents and 3 times as likely to be physically assaulted for their non-religious beliefs compared to other members of the community. So compared to other non-religious participants who took the survey. So this is not talking about everybody nationally, but because it's within the sample, this is a useful comparison because we're talking about people that took the survey. So 3 times as likely as compared to everyone else. Ex-Muslims were about 2 times as likely to experience negative interactions with police and court systems. And non-religious, I mentioned this earlier, veterans and service members had about 1/2 had negative experiences during their service. So when it comes to young non-religious people, we had some really stark numbers. And this is the first report, subpopulation brief that I want to get into. And so we're going to be really focused on this over the next couple months. But they were about 5 times more likely than other non-religious participants to be physically assaulted because of their non-religious beliefs, twice as likely to be threatened, twice as likely to screen positive for depression. About 1/3 had encountered discrimination in education. So that's about the same as the general population of the survey. So same as the rest of the participants. It was only slightly higher, but it was about a third. They also faced more discrimination than the other participants in the survey in areas like mental health services, reproductive care, and volunteer work. And they experienced stigma that was 12.6% higher than other participants. Really, there is sort of a positive aspect I want to highlight this too. Those with very supportive parents had about 1/4 less average concealment than other young people with less supportive parents. So we show that that does make a difference. One of the things I want to delve into that we don't actually have numbers on at the moment, for example, was, okay, that's great. How does that affect psychological outcomes? You know, does that make a difference in educational attainment and in loneliness and depression? So those things are something I really want to delve into in these types of briefs I've been talking about. But these numbers are really interesting and I think important for us to look at more closely. We also asked the participants about what their policy priorities are. And this is a chart where we asked people to identify their top 3 policy priorities for secular or secular movement organizations to engage in from among a list. And you can see it's kind of a major difference here. The most popular item by far was maintaining secular public schools, with more than 50% people said that that's a key policy priority, followed by opposing religious exemptions that allowed for discrimination and access to abortion and contraception. So those were the top 3. I think there's a stereotype about non-religious people that all we care about is religious displays on public property, and that we're just run around pointing at crosses or something, I don't know. But regardless, you can see that that fell at the bottom of the list, where people thought that was the least important of these policy priorities that the groups should be focused on, which is about 13.3%. So I think there's a clear interest in the nearly 34,000 people that took the survey that maintaining secular public schools is incredibly important and something we should be focused on, as well as these other items you can see at the top of the list. My goal is that this will help us and other organizations like SSA and other national organizations really set our agenda and what we should be focusing on as a community and as individual organizations to better represent non-religious people. One of the things I thought was really interesting was there was a high degree of people that wanted to focus on climate change. I don't think that most of the major secular organizations focus on climate change. So I thought that was really interesting, and maybe we should explore more in that area. Okay, so another stereotype about non-religious people is that we do not vote. And I think this comes from some of the surveys I spoke about earlier from like Pew and PRI that show that nuns or religiously unaffiliated people vote less frequently than members of the general population. However, at least among people who participated in this survey that are non-religious, we show that that's not the case. So I think the difference is we're talking about nuns, that's the broader 26%, versus non-religious people, which is the 9% of the population that is specifically non-religious. So we found about 95% were registered to vote. 87% voted in 2016, and about the same percent always or nearly always vote, which is a very high voting rate. I believe for the general population, I don't know if I have the number here, I thought it was about 50% vote on a regular basis or had voted in 2016. Yeah, 55.7% of the general voting age public voted in 2016. Now, that's not directly comparable, but you can see that among this population, there was a high number of people voting significantly. Like this is a very high rate of voting, which is great. And this will be useful for us when we go to speak to lawmakers and say, hey, we care about these issues. We exist all over the country. There's more of us than you think, and we vote. So I think that's a useful message, and we can use this report to talk about that sort of thing when we advocate with lawmakers. And I think lastly, we talked about local group engagement, and this is 2 separate charts. We asked, whether people had participated or interested in participating in activities with local non-religious groups, such as social opportunities, debates, volunteering, or advocacy. And you can see there's a high degree of interest in some participation, particularly in social opportunities. The thing that people indicated the most interest in was resources for people with children. which I've heard anecdotally is sometimes a real lack in different areas for people that want to engage with local groups, local secular groups, or go to local secular events. And so I thought that was really interesting. And we also asked, I mean, we believe that participating in some of these events and also being connected at the local level or at the national level may be a protective factor for to reduce the rate of loneliness and depression that people feel. And that was that we showed that that was the case. So for people that identify or that had membership in at least one national secular organization, that participated in at least one secular activity from the ones listed above, or that were a local group member, for example, participating in a local SSA, for example, had reduced likelihood of depression significantly. You can see the differences here, 1/3 to 25% reduced likelihood of depression. So this just shows us that community is really important, and that participating and forming these social networks can help deal with isolation and depression. And there's a lot more data in the report. Oh, let me just talk about this. So I mentioned that we will be jointly creating briefs for populations, beginning with non-religious youth, and we're going to be doing additional webinars based on this data. We're also going to be making the data available for our partner organizations. We're currently exploring how to do that with the University of Michigan so that they can host the data. So I'm hoping that will be up in the near future, made available to partner organizations and researchers so they can use it as well. And we'd love your help in raising awareness about the data. For example, you can send it to lawmakers so that they can have a better idea of what the community looks like and what we care about, and yes, that we vote. We have an action alert right on the secularsurvey.org website where you can it's very simple to fill out. You just fill it out and it will go right to your all of your local officials. So it's really easy to do, and it will hopefully help raise awareness. And we also asked to help raise awareness about the report and the data by tweeting about it. We have a lot of graphics right on the secularsurvey.org website, and those are the hashtags. And I would love to take questions for the remaining part of this. I hope I have a bunch. Ryan, do we?
We have a couple, and more will come in, I find, as we do this.
Fantastic.
People think of questions as other people are asking questions. So let me invite Christina to ask her question. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Christina, if you want to, and ask your question.
Hi, I was just wondering if with this study you were able to collect any data specifically on ex-Mormons, especially considering how Utah was really high in the discrimination, stigmatization issues.
That is a great question. Unfortunately, no, we did not break out Mormons versus other types of Christian groups. And, if I could do that over again, I probably would have. But the fact is, doing a massive survey like this, you learn a lot each time. And as we do it in the future, I think that's something I definitely want to do. The other major thing I want to do better is outreach to, different subpopulations of atheists, particularly, Black non-believers and Latinx non-believers and several different other ones, because I think we can do much, much better in that regard in getting some of those numbers. Now, to be clear, we did get enough numbers to report meaningful data on each of those populations, and that's what we're going to be doing in the subpopulation briefs. But anyway, that's a long answer to your short question. No, we did not.
Another question that came in, person's anonymous. Wow, this is good. What results surprised you the most? This is kind of a personal question.
Yeah, well, like I said, I think it is the level of discrimination in very religious areas. I mean, I had known that there was discrimination against obviously non-religious people in very religious areas, but the level of it was very, very high, and the level of stigmatization in those places was very high. And, that has a real impact on people. And so I think that has an impact on concealment. We actually collected, I think at the end of the report, there were 2 questions. We asked how people came to realize their non-religious identity and revealed it to other people. An LGBT person would say coming out, but I didn't want to use that language because not everyone knows what that means. But so we asked that. And then we asked, secondly, have you experienced any discrimination? And we had about a third of people who took the survey respond to one or both of those questions. Normally on a survey like this, you only get like 5%. So that just showed the level of interest in getting people's stories out there. And for people, for like many in many instances, the first time they're able to talk about this sort of aspect of their lives. And we have over 10, I think about 12,000 stories right now, and some of them are just really shocking of the sort of discrimination people face. So I found that I should also say we put little snippets of those stories throughout the report, so you can get a flavor of them as well. And I found that to be one of the most interesting parts, was to hear about how these issues have affected people's lives.
Yeah, I think if you mentioned that you've lived in mostly like cosmopolitan urban areas where there's a lot of diversity, and you didn't really experience that discrimination personally. And it's same is true for me. Like I left my religion only a few years ago and have lived in Southern California the entire time that I've been a non-believer. And it is a weird thing about human nature. And I think we see it even with the COVID crisis, that if you haven't experienced something yourself, it's harder to imagine that it exists.
Yes.
It's a weird thing. Like you can kind of intellectualize about it, like, oh, people are getting sick from COVID. But if you don't know anybody that is sick and you've not gotten sick, it doesn't seem as bad as suddenly if someone has it, it's like right in front of you. And
Right.
I think I've also been probably guilty of thinking like, is it really, that bad? But I think since working at SSA, it's really brought home to me, similar to you, that we hear these stories from students that live not in Southern California or New York City, but other places in the Midwest and the South, where it's hard. It's hard for them, and it does have negative psychological and negative even physical ramifications in people's lives.
Absolutely. And it also goes to show the importance of community in those places, like the importance that SSA does, frankly. I mean, that community can save lives. It's really important.
Wow. Yeah, to put it that way is quite a thing. Someone asks, any interesting differences between younger and older non-believers that you noticed?
Yes. Well, I mean, I highlighted that slide earlier of stats regarding non-religious young people. I'll go back to that just because it might be useful. Okay. So yeah, these are examples of the differences. This is something that we're going to explore in much greater detail in the subpopulation brief that will be forthcoming. And Ryan, I'm going to be reaching out to you. I didn't want to bother you before your conference, but expect an email from me next week so that we can work on this.
Great.
So anyway, yes, we'll be going into this in greater detail, but these are just a few preliminary numbers we were able to pull from the data that we already have, the analysis that was already done.
Yeah, it's a different world, and as fast as things are secularizing, we had an earlier who was it? Man, we've had so many presentations. We're only halfway through. Hemet yesterday was talking about running for office and whether the question about whether you would vote for an atheist for president.
Yeah.
And among younger, like millennial aged adults, like early 20s to late 20s type of thing, 77% said they would vote for an atheist, which is a huge change. But this really shows you that on a personal level, it perhaps hasn't changed as much as we might think.
That's right. Yeah.
Ooh, the questions are pouring in. Oh, this is good. Let's see. On that subject, I'll jump to Dave Rice. Good to see you, Dave. Let me open your phone line here. On that subject of higher elected officials. Whoops, I think I did the wrong one. 1 second. These things jump around on me. Hey, there you are, Dave. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. You kind of just almost answered this question, but I mean, do you see any time in the near future when an open candidate could actually claim to be an atheist and get away with that? And kind of a follow-up question was, when do you think presidential candidates can stop pretending to be religious just to please the masses?
Sure, that's a great question. When you say a candidate, I'm assuming you mean a presidential candidate and not like a candidate for office at some other level, because I would say that there are plenty of people that run for office as atheists at
I
other
was
levels.
thinking more higher level offices like, congressman or president. Yeah, I was thinking of those higher ones.
Yeah. Well, I think in Congress we have a few people that have identified as humanists or as sort of secular, non-religious. There hasn't been people that say explicitly atheist, but I think that we have, for example, people that have sort of come together to support the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. Now, those people aren't necessarily, they can have any type of religious belief, but or no religious beliefs, but they I think that there's more openness and that they've shown that people can have different varieties of beliefs and still run for office even at those higher levels. I do think that at the national level, based on the level of religiosity and these polls we're seeing, it might be some time before we can you know have a presidential candidate that actively identifies as like a non-religious person. Although, Bernie Sanders identified as what, a secular Jew, right? And he was very close to winning the Democratic primary for a while. So, I mean, I can't really say. I'd just be speculating. I would say that there's evidence in both directions, and we'll see what happens.
Let's see, where do we go next? Here's an interesting question about the relationship with women in the atheist community. This person writes, I know that previously women felt somewhat overlooked by the atheist community. And I presume this has to do with kind of overlapping discriminations. Is that data, any data that this is changing?
That is a great question. And I should say, before we actually did this survey, what we did a series of focus groups at our conference in 2019. And basically the idea was, because this type of work has not been done in this way, we really wanted to get a basis and understand, well, what concerns people have in their lives and what sort of questions should we be asking. And one of the interesting things we found is that non-religious women had very different concerns, or they spoke about their beliefs and brought up concerns very differently in circumstances where they were just women in the room versus when they were in mixed genders. And so I thought that was interesting. We have not yet broken out data on the basis, for looking at women specifically. That's something that we're interested in doing potentially as one of the subpopulations that we look at. And so we're going to explore doing that. But I don't have any specific data other than that at this point, unfortunately, other than to say that in the focus groups, women expressed a very high interest in things like, I mentioned resources for parents and children. That was something that the reason we asked about that was because of the focus groups and the interest in that by women.
So this next question from W.W. Hill, I don't know if you'd like to ask it yourself. It's sort of similar, I think, than what you were just addressing. Go ahead. Do you want to go? You want to ask that question? If you'd like to unmute yourself, you don't have to. I can also just read it. Okay, so he says, or she says, they say, thank you for, oh, go ahead. I see you unmuted yourself. Go for it.
Oh, go ahead. Maybe I can try. I'm never sure whether the muting works or to what extent you can hear me. Yeah, thank you for speaking to our, I'll just read what I wrote. Thank you for speaking to our group in Washington several weeks ago. Here's a lot of the basic data here. So I know some of the data are known, but you really have a new contribution, and that this survey shows that there's discrimination against non-religious people. To what extent can you show us that the discrimination is because of religious beliefs or some other characteristic of the person? My impression is there's a disproportionate number of the non-secular people of color identify in non-traditional sex roles. To what extent can you tell us that discrimination is due to being in one of those other minority communities?
Sure, that's a great question. So we asked specifically, have you faced discrimination because of your non-religious identity, right? So that's what we asked the question about. Now, sometimes people don't know why they're facing discrimination, right? And sometimes it's a mixture of things. Sometimes they think they're facing discrimination for one thing when it's actually something else, right? So, it's not perfect, but it is that is the question that we asked. Like, did did you face discrimination based on your non-religious identity? So those are the numbers that we presented.
Another one here, which I guess anytime you do a survey, I guess we really want it to answer all of our questions.
Right, of course. Believe me, I fought with the researcher because I wanted more questions, but it's really important you keep it limited, because otherwise your test takers will drop off, and then
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you only can put people through so much, I suppose, unless you're going to pay them a couple $100 or something. And then I guess you run into other problems. Any statistical differences between those who were religious and then became non-religious versus those who were never religious?
That is a good question. I don't think we actually I can answer that. I think we could answer it from the data, because we did ask, what religion, if any, were you raised in? And that chart is available. So we show, there's both a chart showing what religion people were raised in or no religion, and also, how strict was their religious upbringing by different religions, so that you can see that data. I think there was about 14, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was about 14% of people said that they were not raised in religious families. So the vast majority of people were raised in religious families. And you could contrast those two and look at differences. We did not do that yet. It's something that could certainly be done in the future. But like I said, there's a limited amount of analysis we could do in a giant report like this.
Well, it's good to know that the data, at least to a certain degree, exists and can be analyzed for that, to answer that question. And then I guess related to all of these other questions about what the survey data can tell us, do you, American Atheists, plan to repeat the survey to look at how this changes in longitudinally? Or I guess longitudinally you'd have to track the same people.
Well, it's still longitudinal. It's just not. It's not a cohort. It's still longitudinal.
Gotcha.
But yes, longitudinal just means over time.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, I would like to, but we don't have specific plans at this point, I should say. Yeah, no, I'd love to do this again in 5 years. I think we could do it even better. I think this is incredibly successful, but I think we could do it even better, and that we could more actively work to raise awareness about it. We can get even more numbers. We had to cut off, there was so much interest, we had to cut off the field period, is what it's called, is the part where the survey's open, after about 2 weeks, when I originally wanted to do a month, just because it was so many numbers. And I don't know if people know this, but with big things like Qualtrics, you have to actually pay per response. So
Per response.
Per response.
Wow.
Yeah, so it just ended up being a lot of money. So eventually we had to
You're like, stop.
I really want to hear from everybody, but this is $30,000. So we had to, eventually cut it off. But even more planning, we could do even more, and maybe do more fundraising campaigns around it, so we could do a bigger survey. But just to give you an idea, I would love to do that in the future. We don't have any specific plans at this point.
And you had one of the questions that had come up in my conversations, both internally here with us at SSA, because we're sort of overseeing the Secular America Votes program this year, encouraging all of our secular organizations not only to obviously register and vote themselves, but to reach out to their networks and register as many people. And with the ultimate goal of one day having a secular kind of voting block in the way that religious conservatives have a voting block, and they can demand more. Then I lost my. Your data showed that at least this group of survey respondents were highly civically engaged.
Very.
But there was some question about how much we can extrapolate that to the wider, like, non-religious or secular.
Yeah, I mean, just because we have a high degree of people participating here, we just might have people that actively participate in everything, right? We might so it's not, you can't extrapolate that to the broad atheist community. However, we do have 34,000 people, and that's not nothing. So, it's a very large number of survey respondents, and it was a very high rate of participation. So we can't specifically say something about the broader community. However, we can show that at least, there is a segment that's very, very active. And I don't know, we can also encourage groups that do more, like, population surveys like Pew and PRI, which do look specifically at voting returns by religion, to look at our community more carefully instead of just grouping us in with the nuns, because the nuns are clearly masking turnout. I mean, you know what I mean? They're masking our ability to talk about the community, because it's this broad group that there's some real differences between non-religious people and people that are religious. I mean, that's the entire point, right? So I don't know how you can identify those people as non-religious when they actively believe in a God.
Maybe one final question. I know we're just about out of time. I'm curious whether, obviously this data is super important and interesting to us. Everybody likes to look in the mirror and admire themselves, and so it's like, oh, look at this interesting data, and 30,000. Like I've seen, statistics is a big gap in my education. It's like magic to me how they can, I've seen people draw broad generalizations from less than 1,000, surveys. With 30,000, I mean, this is a lot of data.
Yeah, it's about distribution. It's about distribution. So is it representative is the question. So that's why I can do it. Yeah, anyway, go ahead.
I'll hit you up for a tutorial on statistics. Yeah. I'm wondering if other research organizations, public survey organizations have taken notice of this. I mean, is it so far echoing around in the secular community, or my thought is that if Pew or PRI sees this, it might prompt them to do something different, as you suggested a moment ago, to break out the nuns.
Well, they're aware of it because I sent it to them. So I know they're aware of it. And we also had sort of a research advisory committee for the project. So those researchers are aware of it as too. But people haven't reached out and asked about it in that respect. I feel like once we make the data available as we plan to through the University of Michigan, and they have a minority data sort of project where they have this sort of clearinghouse of data. And so once people are able to access it in that way and are able to use it, I think that maybe there'll be more interest. But I mean, I would love to have conversations with Pew and PRI and talk about how they might think about modifying the questions they asked to better get at some of the things that we found.
Yeah, it might refine their approach the next time they do that general religious attitude survey.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. This is, so informative. Really encourage everyone to go to secularsurvey.org and download it for yourself, read it on your iPad or print it if you must.
And do the action alert there too, so that you're send it to your lawmakers.
Right. Yes, absolutely. You can send it out to your lawmakers. You can use your social media I think you have a social media toolkit as well, don't you, with some graphics and such that people can share. Find the factoid that strikes you the most and share that on your Facebook and so forth and get some conversations going. But I look forward to working with you on this with Secular Student Alliance in the future. And thank you so much for being, I know how busy you are, and taking the time to be with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for joining us. Stick around for our next couple of sessions. We have at 4:30 this evening, Pacific time, 7:30 Eastern. We have Chris Cameron, academic at University of North Carolina, and talking about Black free thinkers of history of civil rights era, pre-civil rights era. And the next session is with Callie Wright, talking about how to have difficult conversations. If you've ever struggled with having difficult conversations on social media, for example, Callie has some great suggestions for us. So we'll see you there. Bye-bye.